Thank you, everybody. So we move on to the next session, which is, I suppose, a challenge to all of us, where we're all immersed or beginning to become, or to understand perhaps, the challenges facing us when it comes to the decade of centenaries. And therefore, we're talking about 1912, we're talking about the lockout, of course, we're talking about the Ulster Covenant, we're talking about the First World War, Easter Rising, Battle of Somme, and so forth. But at the tail end of, just about the tail end of the decade in centenaries, if, as we assume, that the decade goes from 1912 to 1922, there is a historical event at the end of that 22 that I think, as we begin to understand it more, I think we'll have even more challenges for us to try and, from an artistic point of view, either deal with or engage with or indeed ignore. And on that basis, I was very struck by the scholarly work of our next speaker, Dr. Anne Dolan. She's a lecturer in modern Irish history at Trinity College, Dublin. She's author of Commemorating the Irish Civil War, History and Memory, 1922 to 2000. And with Cormac O'Malley is co-editor of No Surrender Here, the Civil War Papers of Ernie O'Malley. She's currently working on a history of violence in post-war Ireland. So I'd like you to welcome Dr. Anne Dolan.
First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Fiach, to Jan and to Kelly for having me here. And I'm very, very struck after the last panel particularly that I wander around in the midst of things that are nearly 100 years past, and there's a kind of comfort there. And I'm very conscious of what I have to say. It might reveal, if you like, some of the complacency of my discipline in the light of what we've just heard. But I want to begin on a back road in Cavan, in a small place more than 5 years after Civil War has passed. I want to begin in the summer of 1928 with a row over missing turf, with insults thrown, with a war of words that ended up in court. A man called Philip Smith was ordered to pay £10 damages to Lucy Galligan because he called her virtue into disrepute. Whether Mrs. Galligan was as chaste as she might have been, we may never know or need to care. But in the course of the case, the judge uncovered some of the other things Smith had said, some more of what passed for insults in that small place in Cavan in 1928. Smith said things about the Galligans' children, more about a boy they'd taken in from the county home. And then he said Lucy Galligan's husband ought to be shot for thatching Sarahan's house. James and Mary Ann Sarahan had been killed back in December 1923. A little more than 6 months after the end of the Civil War, two men forced their way in, and murdered husband and wife under that roof that Galligan had thatched. At the time, the newspapers called their deaths the most atrocious murder ever committed in this country, which was quite a claim given the share of violence the country had just seen. Admittedly, Cavan had not known the kinds of violence other counties knew, and maybe murder of any kind was shocking when war was supposed to have given way to peace. Maybe that alone was enough to prompt such headlines. But maybe it was because the Sarahan's 7-month-old daughter was found, as one paper put it, sleeping with its little nightdress saturated in her mother's blood. Maybe it was just the awful vividness of that stain on that little dress. Maybe it merited most atrocious because Mary Ann Sarahan was shot in the face, because she was over 4 months pregnant, carrying a son, as her post-mortem revealed. Maybe it was just because the idea of men coming to the door in the darkness, forcing their way in, was all supposed to be done and gone by the end of 1923. Wasn't all of that finished? Hadn't that at least gone away? The same newspapers that called this atrocious were also quick to say as follows: the crime has no political significance. And maybe it hadn't in any obvious sense. The Sarahans died because of land, because of 8 acres, 2 cattle and 4 pigs. There had been trouble between the Sarahans and the Bryades. Families fell out, stones were thrown into Sarahan's meadow, there were accusations, Sarahan made charges of assault. The day before his death, Sarahan gave evidence in court, earning Bryade 2 months of hard labour in jail. Sarahan died knowing his evidence, and that jail sentence cost him and his wife their lives. His killers told him so before he died. Beside Mary Ann Sarahan's body, police found an old revolver, described of bulldog pattern and of British make. Bryade was named in the newspapers as a well-known Gael, as a good Gael. He may well have known the right people with an old revolver at the bitter end of 1923 to carry out this task. But it doesn't end there. No one would buy hay or oats from the farm the following year. Sarahan's brother preferred to face court in 1925 rather than deal with his brother's debts, too afraid to have anything to do with the farm or what little money Sarahan left behind. Nearly 5 years after these deaths, the charge of thatching their roof was as bad as slut or whore or whatever aspersion Philip Smith could think to cast on a married woman's virtue during a squabble on the side of the road. It was still part of the winning and the losing of a small local row. Still part of the cruel banter of the back roads that said Cavan had no intention of burying its hatreds with its dead. This is just a small example. It wasn't hard to find. And while it is not, as the papers said, about politics, about war or revolution, about rebellion or civil war as we are maybe meant to define them, it's not untouched or unshaped by them either. What brought a big British bulldog revolver to the end of Cavan in December 1923? What made and shaped the men who now knew how to use it, who now knew how to kill in that way, and still thought killing was the settler of old scores long after civil war was done? I'm not suggesting that we create a history of the Irish Civil War that includes every fought-over field, every overwrought local passion that loses itself in the hatreds of small places where sins are known, seed, breed, and generation. Don't worry, Homer's ghost is not whispering here as he did to Patrick Kavanagh. I only want to pose a question, not craft an Iliad from such a local row. And the question, what is it? Well, given what the sources let us find and the approaches historians are now prepared to take to them, do we really want a history of the Irish Civil War? I suppose what I'm asking is, how should historians respond to violence? What are we supposed to do with civil war? With a history of division that has no saving message, no lesson, no upright tale to tell, no knowing moral to save the story, when there is nothing that can stitch us all neatly back together here and now? Should we make it a history of political divides, even class divisions, see it in coldly ideological terms, turn away from the quality of the violence because, like mercy, violence has a quality of its own? Should we write a history of war without looking its violence square on in the face? The nature of the Irish Civil War's violence, its executions, the use of trap mines, what was and was not done to prisoners of either side in Kerry's Woods. We know its violence was more intense than what went before. We know, like other civil wars, that the fight was more furious because the enemy was once so close. More probably died in that shorter period from mid-1922 to mid-1923 than in the War of Independence, at least twice as long in length, which had just gone before. But we can only say probably still. That we don't know for sure is suggestive of how reluctant we still are to tackle what the Civil War might throw up. How should historians respond when the records show us little but life and death at its awful best and worst, when the records remind us of how divided we were and what we were wantonly capable of? Bound in by the evidence, I can't really pick and choose. I can't make it more uplifting, can't decide that there'll be a happy ending this time around. If anything, history, when it has tried, has been too neat and tidy about the Irish Civil War. The Sarahans and their killers, if nothing else, proved that. We have lazily accepted labels and chronologies, presuming we know when one war begins and another ends because a higher political narrative says it's so. The Sarahans' killers did not march to that particular beat, nor, for instance, did the Keogh gang, as they called themselves, rampaging around Galway, robbing post offices, taking what they wanted, whenever they wanted, leading one fearful citizen of the new Irish Free State to write to the Minister for Justice in December 1923 that if this was not stopped, every district and parish will have its criminal boss of whom the people live in absolute terror. The Garda reports that kept coming to Cabinet from every county on through 1925 and beyond still searched for signs it had come to identify with civil war. And they kept watching long after historians often assume we need to care. The kinds of motivations, expectations that express themselves in civil war, that show themselves in and around the little that passed for traditional conflict, forces us out of any easy reading or conception of civil war's violence. The hunger for land had room to gorge itself when law and order seemed so far away. In some cases, land was taken back that had been lost decades before. While some just took what they could, temptation itself just too great. For others, it was a time for revenge. John Gunn was disbanded from the RIC on a Thursday, made it home to his family, and by Sunday was shot dead. There were others like Gunn, Others, like John Haughey, given 5 days to quit the country, who fled to London, leaving a wife and 8 children behind. For them and for many more, for those who fled and those who were fled from, there was none of the clarity about where one war ended and another began that we now seem so sure of. Equally, we have to admit that civil war, like the violence that went before it, had all sorts of motives that cannot be simply unravelled and then isolated out. They move messily, unself-consciously along, regardless of whether we call it war of independence or civil war. The admission of sectarianism as part of what motivated violence in the South at any point in the 1919 to 23 period has come a long, hard road. Historians are currently tying themselves up in knots about the killing of 18 people in West Cork, in Dunmanway and around the Bandon Valley over 3 nights in April 1922. For many, it still has to be either fish or flesh, when the best we can sometimes do is to admit that it was a horrible mess of both and maybe more. While we need to understand these 2 nights of violence, we also have to hear a police report from the same town from nearby villages 2 years later. In April 1924, cattle and sheep were being stolen around Clonakilty and Bandon. In nearly all the cases, the victims are said to be Protestant farmers, the police report said. Those 3 nights in April 1922 might have started it, interrupted it, but when did Bandon's own kind of wars ever really end? The more we see of the records, the more the distinctions begin to blur. Irishmen killed Irishmen and women throughout the period from 1916 onwards. There's a quality to the violence of 1922-3 that is clearly to be found in the years that have just gone before. The truce period as we traditionally know it, those months from July 1921 to June 22, can only be conceived as peaceful if we turn a blind eye to the continued use of violence, if we overlook those who go missing, those shot and killed, those driven out, those local settlings of old scores. Also, the sequence of events we accept from 1918 onwards through the War of Independence, and remember, we can't really agree on what to call that war, through the truce, through the Civil War, makes no sense if we follow what becomes Northern Ireland's trajectory of violence. Violence increases there during the truce period. It eases but continues through 1922 and 1923, but it never really gets included in what we define as the Irish Civil War. There's a messiness about the whole period, a quality to the violence that makes for many civil wars that bleed beyond the margins we've largely drawn for a kind of chronological convenience, so we can set our wars apart, classify it all neat and tidily away. But like anything that doesn't fit in where it's put, it will find its way out in some form, in some way. Even the example of the Sorahans and the Bridys show us how. If it's possible to document the hatreds of those 2 families, if we can see the blood on the child's nightdress, hear one of Sarahan's killers say, "Let him take that, lest he is not done in," as he stood over him and shot him for the 4th time, think how easy it is to document the hatreds, the violence of more significant wars. The history of violence, the kinds of questions historians have been asking of the violence, of many conflicts and in many countries for many years now, take us more and more to the experience of violence itself, to its meanings, to the sense of what violence asked of those who fought, to what it did to those who suffered in all war's wake. The question is, do we really want to see it? Or at least see it when war is civil war, when there's no one else we can possibly blame? In recent years in Ireland, there has been considerable political will towards finding our shared history on this island, finding some sort of past, north and south, that says something hopefully constructive to a peace process present. Equally, a republic still stunned by bailout, red raw from austerity, might have very little appetite to dwell on just how many people were executed at the foundation of this state. 34 were executed in January 1923 alone, almost as many in 1 month as the British executed between 1916 and 1921 altogether. I would imagine Easter 2016 will have far more to say about how martyrs were made in prison yards than January 2023. But that's fine, probably as it should be. Commemoration is not history after all, and really the Civil War was always going to be a kind of banquo at the current commemorative feast. The government's decade of commemoration, as Fiach mentioned, and there is a website with that very name, begins in 1912. There's a reason I'm a historian. My grasp of mathematics might be rudimentary, but the Civil War does, by my thought, take us up to 1923. And 11 years into a decade just doesn't go. Civil war is a commemorative problem, but that doesn't mean it has to continue to be a historical one. The records, or at least the questions historians are more willing to ask of them, are at odds with the impetus to let sleeping dogs lie. The Northern Troubles may well have acted as a muzzle on certain kinds of historical inquiry while they raged, but it would be a shame to simply exchange that muzzle for a straitjacket because we have a peace process now. Political pressure may be there to find the things that unite us all, but the challenge has to be to write as openly as possible about our disconnections, to understand them as much, if not more so, than our obvious connections. To write about our violence, our shared wars, our wars amongst ourselves, without feeling an obligation to do our bit for peace. Seeking out shared traditions only makes sense in the context of examining the hatreds and the bigotries, the silences and the disconnections that countered them. Looking at them in isolation is like praising the stitching but never admitting there was once a tear. Another solution might be to balance the dirty deeds of all sides in all conflicts and hope that in casting a kind of plague on all their houses it might be the most equitable solution of all. But the records do not always present us with a neat and tidy accumulation. Our books will probably not balance because there are winners and losers. There are the marginalised and the minorities. There are the Sarahans who fall from far baser motives than we might want to expect. And we have to be able to write of the perpetrators of violence and of the worsted in the game without being held up as proponents or opponents of what was and was not done then as well as now. In many respects, the force of the records is too strong for it to be otherwise. Combatants' testimonies tell of their fears, their hatreds, their pleasures, the burdens of war they carried with them in the years after, and the maybe more striking returns so many of them made to their own kinds of normality, however defined. The dead of the Civil War tell us something of the nature of civil war itself. They tell us who found their ways into the war on whatever side. They tell us the kinds of war they found themselves victim of. They tell of what it took to kill them, to shoot them closer at a distance, to hear their silence or their screams, to shoot a fourth time, to be sure, as Sarahan's killers did, lest he not be done in. Sergeant Thomas McGrath was about 8 months a soldier. He had joined the National Army, had taken the pro-treaty side. Home on leave in Tipperary in March 1923, he was taken and found dead on the side of the road. The men who killed him first got him a priest to pray with him, to give him the sacraments, to get him ready for a proper death. The men who showed him this kindness then shot him 5 times, 3 times in the head. A label pinned to his coat said he knew he went to his death labelled as a spy, or that the men who killed him were called upon to pin it to his lifeless chest. The pages later found in an abandoned house nearby, with several practiced attempts at those 3 letters SPY, say something of what that label took to write. The labours of an unpractised hand, perhaps, the mistakes of an unsteady hand, the record of a worried and distracted mind. Either way, it took a few attempts to get that word written right. The marriage certificate in McGrath's pocket said he had a wife of just 2 months, that someone had cared enough about him to sew a religious medal into the collar of his coat. With all of this, with all that can be known, it isn't just about who won and who lost anymore. It isn't about taking a side, measuring right against wrong, proving a point. It's about understanding what it is that violence does, who it does it to, what it asks of those who fight, of those who watch, of those who pass quietly by. It's about Michael Collins and Liam Lynch and all the other familiar names of our history. But it's also about Jane Harper as well, a 45-year-old woman in Donegal who took her own life in the middle of the Irish Civil War because she believed she was going to be shot. It's about letting war end when those who fought it and lived through it said it stopped, letting them measure the time of civil war to their own different beats. It's about getting back to the mess civil war actually was, undoing the neatness and the tidiness that tries to make a single sense of it all. There doesn't get to be easy heroes and villains anymore. Perpetrators and victims are too often one and the same kind. That said, for many, civil war was just a fleeting thing, something in the news that didn't really touch their lives, and it needs to be said that civil war was not all of everything for everyone, even for those who fought. There's room to admit life carried on, that there was far more to Irish life than war. Indeed, we might even concede that our war was not the only war, that actually in comparative terms we were really rather European with our internecine spat. It's not to underestimate the Irish Civil War to say that by international standards it was rather small. Finland, of comparable size in a contemporary conflict, saw between 25,000 and 35,000 casualties, with some 12,000 to 13,000 people losing their lives in prison camps. We had comparatively few casualties, a remarkably quick return to stability and peace. Yet if we admit that, do we undermine all the importance that so many have placed on that war for so long? Or do we find that instead of being ruled and ruined by our divisions, we actually dealt with them relatively peacefully? That given the conditions, there could or maybe should have been more deaths, more spite, more sectarianism, more avarice, more greed. While that is of little consolation to those who paid the price, the Sarahan's death maybe give us a glimpse of what might have been as much as what was. Our massacres are measured in these kinds of small numbers, and we probably shouldn't lose sight of that. But civil war did leave its scars. The recently released military service pensions are beginning to tell us about the wars many continued to wage for their own livelihoods in the years after. In some cases, the wars they waged for their own sanity, long after the fighting was done. We're only beginning to understand the part civil war played in the extent of emigration of the 1920s, in what was and was not possible to do in the Free State because a civil war had to be fought. Equally, civil war is not enough of a reason anymore for what might have been and what was never done. For too long, it's been too easy for us to blame. What's the story with the Irish Civil War? I would quite happily say that I don't know, other than that it's a changing, slippery, confusing thing. Do we need a new history of the Irish Civil War? Well, we probably do. Do we want one? I'll leave that up to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. That's fantastic. Can I just ask you one question, and then we have two questions to the audience, and then we're going to a tea break. I'm going to assume a lot of things, but is your approach towards the study that time your own understanding of violence? I mean, is that your starting point? You're writing a history of violence, I see. So is that your way in terms of looking at how an angular, maybe almost an artistic way into your understanding of the Irish Civil War?
No, I mean, in a way, I came to this project through having done, as you said earlier, at the start, the Civil War letters, Ernie O'Malley's work. I'd looked at a lot of other people's memoirs, their writings between themselves, people who'd fought in the period. I was very, very struck with how much they spoke about what they themselves had done, and equally how much we've avoided engaging with that material. And at the same time, I've been very influenced by how violence has been studied in other places, and the reluctance, to some extent, that we've had was really, well, what do we do with a history of violence in a history of war? And there's this whole sense of, is it exploitative to look at it? Do we really need to see it? Do we want to look at it? But at the same time, if we don't look at it, we don't really understand the nature of what actually happened, or the kind of scars that it left behind, or what it did to places and to people. And if you think of it to often very small towns, very small places that, had to deal with this, had to put themselves back together again. Yeah. And in a way, it's not to try and sensationalise it or to look at it in any kind of, voyeuristic kind of way. I mean, in an odd sense, the striking thing that's coming through to me with doing the work I'm doing now is, in an odd way, how kind of peaceful this place was by comparison to other parts of Europe at the same time. That we did actually manage to come out of this relatively quickly. And that's not to undermine what it did to people here. And that's where it can be a kind of a delicate thing to actually look at.
Okay, two questions, and I'll ask you to keep it to a question, and I'll get two questions in, and then we'll go for a tea break then, yeah? Gentleman here, somebody else? The lady up there, yeah. There are the two questions, yeah. Okay.
I just want to ask, what role do you think artistic representation, be it in theatre or even more contemporary in film, has, particularly coming up in the commemoration, of shaping or influencing our sort of collective idea of the Civil War?
Thank you. And that question there, and then I'll get you out to both. Yeah.
A question similar, but similar in that it's about story making. How much is our reality of how we see Ireland got to do with the political making of our current storytelling, rather than artistic creation? But have we created a story of the Irish state, and can we afford to undo it?
And I'll just roll it all in with your wonderful phrase about your wonderful phrase around the notion of chronological convenience, which is a great unlocking for us of the history, the way we're taught that history doesn't fit into that. So,
no, I mean it's in a way, a quick answer to yourself is there's a huge part for you to play. There's probably a more useful part for you to play than for historians in many respects, because And, you know, there's an awful lot of things that it's maybe about bridging the gap between some of the research that we're finding and some of the material that's still coming out. As I said, there's still new sets of records becoming available. And in a way, it's often the problem, or the reason that so much of this period is still so contested and does cause problems, is the failure to, if you like, communicate what's coming out of the records and what historians are doing with, I suppose, the wider sense of the period itself. And the period it's very important to people. It's part of, you know, it's part of the reason why if you watch Casablanca and that bit in the bar when they start to sing the German song and then they sing the Marseillaise, it's the reason the hair stands up in the back of your neck and you know you're Irish. It's been knitted into all of that. And sometimes historians can march in and say, well, I've got the footnotes and I've been to the archives and I can prove you're wrong about the past. And that's often where the tension arises between, if you like, new versions of the past and that which is held very dear. And in a way, there's a huge place, absolutely, for any form of art and for historians to engage with artists more. And in a sense, I've learned a huge amount the last day and a half about the failings of my own discipline in many respects and the things we don't take account of and how immediate all of this is to the people who've just been on this stage half an hour ago, and how the extent to which it's almost, for want of...
You mentioned your own work with Another Man's Wound and the O'Malley papers. I mean, in a way...
Well, yeah, it's coming through in memoirs, and there's an artistry in a lot of the sources we use as well. And so I'm answering your question in a very rambling kind of way, but yes, is the answer. The other question about, can we afford to undo some of that? And this is where I see this huge gap between what a historian does and that which politicians and people engaging, what they do with commemoration. And I don't blame them anymore for crafting the past to suit the present narrative. I mean, it isn't my job to keep the peace or to make sure the books balance at the end of the year. It's a politician's job. They have to get re-elected. If they're going to use the past, they're going to use the past. They're going to use it in the same way as they use anything else. That's their job. In a way, the problem is, I think, when maybe sometimes historians bend the past to shape, if you like, a current priorities, because we're as human as everybody else, in the sense there's a lot of funding that comes with centenaries and commemorations, and the temptation to avoid getting involved in that can be quite, you know, difficult. So, but certainly there's a very clear narrative coming from, you know, government buildings here, from London, from Stormont, to find a shared history, to find a past that suits everybody. And frankly, you spend a half an hour with the archives, and that becomes a very difficult thing to sort of reconcile. So at the same time, I appreciate where that's coming from.
Thank you, Anne. I'd like to thank Anne for her contribution today.